Hello there, welcome back to Ultraviolet Network's Intro to FortiGate series, Module 2, Initial Configuration. I'm your host, Matt Sharif, and in this module we're going to go over just the basic initial configuration, just enough connectivity to get us out to the internet. The assumptions, pretty basic. Obviously you have a FortiGate, whether it's a physical or a VM, and you've completed Module 1, which is the FortiCare registration. Some of you using trial VMs from just downloaded from the website, this probably doesn't apply to, but the first bullet definitely does apply. What we're going to cover, so some of the feedback on the first video was the fact that, even though I upgraded directly from, was it 626 to 705, and I didn't particularly care about resetting to factory, there were some valid points made in the fact that, despite the fact that my errors were purely cosmetic, that it's a best practice nonetheless to go ahead and execute a factory reset on this. Also, if you have a 1 series device, so if it ends in 1, it has an SSD, and there is an extra step that we need to cover with that. So we're going to go ahead and go over that at the start of this video, and we'll start with a fresh FortiGate. We'll cover LAN and WAN addressing. In the last video, we covered how to apply static addressing. With this video, we're just going to assume dynamic addressing. Then we're going to set up LAN services, LAN addressing, DNS, DHCP, assuming that this FortiGate is going to be providing those services. If they're not, you can go ahead and skip past that section. And then last but not least, we'll create a basic policy to get us out to the internet. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and get started. So once we're connected back up to our FortiGate, and if you recall in the last video, we were using a FortiWi-Fi 81F 2R. So this basically has the hardware switch, built-in AP, has a built-in SSD. And one of the reasons for the choice for this video was so that we can cover all those bases for those who may have different model FortiGates with some of these capabilities. So I'm going to go ahead and get logged in. And to issue a factory reset, it's a very, very basic command. Execute factory reset. And tap yes. It's just going to warn you that, hey, this is going to reset it to factory default. Are you really sure you know what you're doing here? If I went through that many keystrokes and happen to stumble across this, chances are I do. However, just be mindful. It's going to reboot once it resets to factory default. We'll go ahead and go through the reboot here. And then once the reboot's done, we're going to go ahead and format the log disk. And the reason we do that is just to make sure that there's no leftovers that can affect us on the actual SSD. I've seen a couple of instances. It was on older versions of FortiOS, but I've seen a couple of instances where sometimes configuration leftovers end up there. So I just want to be sure that we're starting with something fresh here. Okay, and through the magic of video editing, we're already here. So we're going to log in with admin. Remember the default password, there is none. You will be prompted upon first login to change it. I'm going to go ahead and change it. We're now in. One more thing we need to do, like I mentioned previously, is we need to go ahead and execute format log disk. There are no additional options, so I'm going to type enter. This is going to erase all the data on the log disk. So being that this is a new unit, I don't particularly care about that. Just take some time and understand what this does. So if you have logs or anything you care about on a production unit, you probably don't want to do this. This is okay, again, to do when it's a new unit or when you're upgrading and you skipped a whole bunch of versions and you need to clean it up. Don't do this in production. Don't do this on a production unit unless you're specifically directed to do so. Now it's going to go ahead and format this, and it'll reboot the device, and we'll actually see it perform the format. All right, we're back, and we have, let's see if we can get this, there we go. finish the reboot, and we're going to go ahead and get logged in and take a look at some things. So first things first, let's go ahead and get system interface. This is going to tell us whether or not we picked up a DHCP address off of the WAN one, which we did by default. So we've got this 10.220.27. Good deal. And if you take a look real quick, and we're going to look at this more in depth in the UI. If we do show system interface LAN, so this LAN interface is a software switch that has been created to bridge the hardware switch of internal with the Wi-Fi SSID of Fortinet. So the way we check that out, and this may be a little bit advanced for most of you, but we're actually going to see this in the UI as well. So I just wanted you to know where to find it in the CLI. Show system interface. No, excuse me. Show system switch interface. So a switch interface is a software switch. A virtual switch is a hardware switch. So as you can see, like I said, we grouped the Wi-Fi, which has an SSID of Fortinet, and the internal hardware switch here. So let's go ahead and move over to the browser and we'll get logged in. So as you can see, we've got internet connectivity from the FortiGate, and we've got connection into FortiGuard. It is seeing that we are appropriately licensed. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at the WAN interface real quick. By default, the WAN interface is set for DHCP, and I've obtained my IP address as well as my DNS server and my default gateway. Everything's good there. From there, let's go ahead and take a look at the LAN interface. Currently, we have a software switch as the LAN interface, as we covered earlier in the video, and then this is an amalgamation or a bridging, if you will, to use appropriate terms, of the internal hardware switch as well as the Wi-Fi SSID, or virtual AP, as Fortinet calls it. I'm going to get rid of this interface. Now I will pause and say, if this works for you, this configuration works for you, and you want to proceed with this configuration, by all means, skip this section of the video. Part of the reason I am going through this is it's not my preference. The other reason is I want folks who also want to know how to achieve breaking this apart, how to do this, and I want you to be aware of the options that you have available. So if I were to just click the LAN interface and try to delete it, it would be grayed out. If I tried to do this from the CLI, that too would yell at me and say, hey, it's used. Well, how do I know where this is being used or referenced? If you go to this reference column, you'll see that there's two references here. One is the firewall policy. Every 40F to, I believe, 200F, somewhere within those range. I know it's the lower end FortiGates, and by lower end I just mean smaller size, not necessarily bad device, just the use case is lower end. Comes pre-configured with a firewall policy and a DHCP server on the LAN interface. So two ways we can go ahead and get rid of these. You can just go right here and delete these. I will also show you the other way, which is going to be going to firewall policy and getting rid of this policy. It wasn't doing much for us anyway. And then going back to the LAN interface and turning off the DHCP server that's right here. So we're going to turn that off and click OK. Now our references are 0. We should be able to click on the interface and delete it. Now I'm going to take this even a step further, and I'm going to go ahead and delete the Fortinet Wi-Fi SSID and delete the internal hardware switch. Now I have 6 interfaces, one of whom is lit up and is my quote-unquote LAN interface that we're going to use to connect this Zorin box over here to the internet in a moment. And I don't have any SSIDs broadcasting at this time. So now we're going to go ahead and set the IP address of the LAN interface. And to do that, we double click on the interface. Let's give it the alias of LAN. For the sake of this video, we're going to stick with manual. Know that there are other options. DHCP is where we would assign it the IP address, similar to a WAN interface. Auto managed by IPAM means you're either using FortiIPAM or using the IPAM service on the FortiGate to carve out a subnet for this. Point-to-point protocol over Ethernet, PPPoE. If you have an ISP using PPPoE and you need to support that, you would select that. For one-arm sniffer, you would go ahead and select that. One-arm sniffer is basically where you're having a mirror port to the FortiGate, and it's inspecting traffic and acting as an intrusion detection system. We're going to set the IP to 10.220.28.1, and you can do slash or dotted decimal notation. I'm going to do slash notation. I'll set the administrative access to HTTPS, ping, and security fabric connection. The reason I unchecked HTTP is due to the fact that by selecting HTTP, the FortiGate is going to be listening on port 80. If we were performing an audit scan, or if you had a third party monitoring this, they may ask you why you're listening on port 80. It's not really a secure port anymore. Yes, I know the FortiGate does redirect to HTTPS. However, for the sake of just avoiding having that question altogether, maybe a better practice just to close off the port where you can. Enabling the transmission and reception of LLDP. I'm just going to go ahead and enable that. There's nothing wrong with that. Using the VDOM setting, it would inherit what's under system settings. However, in this case, I'm going to force it to enable. DHCP server. So if we're providing DHCP to the LAN, we're going to go ahead and enable this. And in this case, I'm going to narrow my scope a bit to 100 to 200. The default gateway is going to be the same as the interface IP. The DNS server will be the same as the interface IP. This will require additional configuration that we'll get to in a moment. We'll go to advanced. We're also going to set this interface as an NTP server. So if we have anything that requires an NTP server, we shouldn't need to go to pool.ntp.org. The FortiGate can act as the NTP server for our network. A couple of things I want to point out. If you have additional DHCP options you'd like to set, say for your VoIP handsets or for anything else you may have that requires, say, option 66 or what have you, you can go ahead and create those here. If you click create new and specify your option code and whether it's a string, IP, FQDN, whichever it is you'd like, you can go ahead and set those here. I don't have any options to configure, so I'm going to leave this blank. And then the IP address assignment rules. If we're acting as the DHCP server, one question I get a lot is, hey, how do I do an IP reservation on the FortiGate? Excuse me. And there's a number of ways to do that. The first way is to just click create new and create the MAC address. The type is a MAC address, and you would put the MAC address here and then say reserve IP. And this IP address has to be within the subnet, but it does not necessarily have to be within your DHCP range. So as you noticed earlier, I did from .100 to .200. I could very easily reserve .10 and assign that to the IP, or reserve that IP. If we were to do assign IP or block, this would be very simply, hey, whatever MAC address is in here, we're going to go ahead either and block it or assign it an IP. Where block comes into play, most of you are probably already aware. If I have a MAC address that is xx.xx.xx, and yes, I know the FortiGate's yelling at me because this isn't valid. This isn't valid hexadecimal at all. But we would block that. Where the assigned IP comes along is if we were to change the default behavior of this IP address assignment rules to block. If it's an unknown MAC address, block. So basically don't assign it an IP. We can then say, hey, if we have a MAC address of AA.AA. then assign it an IP from the pool. Whatever IP it is, that doesn't matter. It's not a reservation. I'm only allowing it onto the network. Now, this really doesn't prevent us from being spoofed and someone spoofing an allowed MAC address, but this does limit who you can let onto the network. It is almost the reverse of blocking certain MAC addresses. It's like, nah, we're going to block everything and only allow certain MAC addresses, which makes the guessing game a little harder. This isn't a very common option. Just wanted you to know that that's there. For now, we don't have any reservations. I will show you there's another way and an easier way to create a reservation once you have some clients on the network. That makes life a little bit easier for you. But we're going to go ahead and click OK. And as you can see, my LAN internal 1 is now addressed. We have our address range here. If I were to refresh here, I wonder if I have any DHCP clients yet. Probably not, and that's okay. I did say we needed to perform some additional configuration to get the DNS, NTP, DNS and NTP stuff rolling. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. First things first, if you have only DNS here, not DNS server, we need to go to System, Feature Visibility, DNS Database, click Apply, and our side menu will reload, and if I click on Network again, it's going to reload. Okay, DNS servers. Now we need to create a DNS service on the interface, and I'm going to choose that LAN interface we created, and the default is going to be recursive. So all this is going to do is it's going to proxy these DNS requests, and then if it knows the answer or if it owns the zone, it's going to go ahead and resolve that. However, we don't have any zones on this FortiGate, so it's basically going to pass it on to the system DNS. But what's good about this is we can go ahead and set a DNS filter here, as opposed to just having DNS go external to our network. So if we wanted to filter requests based on DNS, we could do that here, as opposed to in a policy. And we can set DNS over HTTPS. In this case, I'm just going to leave it as regular DNS. And down here is where you can create your DNS zones and add records to that. For now, we're just going to leave that alone. Let's move on to setting NTP so that it's available on that LAN interface. By default, it's enabled because of the FortiLink. Back in 6.0, this used to not be the case. And the reason why this became the default is when folks deployed FortiSwitches, they would show up, you would authorize them, and then they would never actually show up as active in the UI. So the reason for that is because NTP wasn't set up. The switches had a Unix epoch time of 1969, 1970, which is the beginning of all time as far as Unix is concerned. And due to that, the FortiGate and the switches would never establish a connection due to the time being off. So we're going to go ahead and add LAN 1 there. So now any devices on LAN 1 can use the FortiGate as its NTP server. One more thing we're going to go ahead and do here is I'm going to change the admin HTTP port while we're here. Actually, we're just going to leave that alone. Cut this bit out, and we're going to click Apply. So while we're here, let's take a look at some of the other settings that we can change. One thing I do want to point out is I'm going to change this to Eastern Time since I'm in Florida, and we're not 3 hours behind now. Another thing we can change, and I'm going to change, is my default HTTPS port. I prefer changing this to something other than default because I I would rather use 443 for SSL VPN. If you're sitting in a Starbucks or you're sitting somewhere else, like a hotel, they only allow out port 80 and port 443, so let's make that available for SSL VPN. Sure, you can, enable SSL VPN on a port that's not that's not listing for admin sessions, and that'll be fine. I prefer to avoid confusion altogether and change my HTTPS port. So let's click apply for now. And I should be redirected here in a minute. And there we go. And we'll be back at the main page. If we go back to system settings, you can change your SSH and telnet port. Change the idle timeout to something that's suitable to you. For me, I'm going to leave it for 5 now. I typically set this to around 30 minutes, although that may be a little excessive depending on your organizational requirements. So again, don't take organizational security requirements from some guy doing videos on the internet, similar to how you don't take legal advice from that same guy. View settings. If you prefer a dark theme, you can go ahead and change this. I'm going to change mine to Mariner. A couple of other options I'll point out here is the next generation firewall mode, whether it's profile based or policy based. The big difference between these is how you filter out layer 7 sessions or layer 7 applications. Profile based allows you to compile large profiles of applications that you're going to allow, versus the policy based allows you to call out the applications individually in the policy. Some of you coming from other platforms such as Palo Alto Networks, you're probably going to note that policy based feels a lot like how Palo Alto does firewalling. And this is a matter of preference. However, most of the documentations and the scope of this course is going to be primarily based on profile-based. We will cover policy-based a little bit at a high level. However, most of the focus is going to be on profile-based. One more thing I'd like to point out is central SNAT. By default, it's disabled. So central SNAT, for those of you coming from Cisco, Palo Alto, and others, is where you have a NAT table saying, hey, I want these IPs to translate to this external IP address if they're going to this source or destination. The default mode for NAT in FortiGate is policy NAT, and when we create a policy, we can go ahead and take a look at that. So we're going to click apply to make sure all of our changes applied. Okay, so we're going to go take a look at a couple of things before we configure our policy. I'm going to go ahead and take a look on this VM we have here. Wired settings. Take a look. So he's got an old configuration here real quick, I believe. So let's go double check that real quick, because I know that's what we did set our yeah, it's an old configuration. So I'm going to disable this real quick, and I'm going to turn it back on, and we're going to see what happens. That one more time. Wired, turn off, yep, oh, so, more point. Connect, and should have a DHCP address here. Yes, we have a DHCP client now. And if we go take a look under the network dashboard, you will see this is our Zorin device. I can go ahead and create a DHCP reservation right here. You right click on it, click create DHCP reservation. If you'd like, you can create a firewall MAC address object. I'm not going to. The MAC address objects are helpful for filtering because the MAC address follows the device regardless of the IP address it has. However, MAC address spoofing is a thing, and if you're using this for mobile devices like iPhone now, will set a private MAC address. So all the user has to do is turn off the private connectivity and then turn it back on, and it'll generate a different MAC address. So I tend to not filter based on those. But we're creating this reservation here. So we've got the device, he's got a reservation, he's got everything he needs, but he still can't get out to the internet. And the reason why is we're missing a policy. We've still got this. This is a firewall, so unless we explicitly tell it to allow traffic, it's not going to allow it. So we're going to click Create New and give it a name that's meaningful. So as you start to grow these policies, and many of you will manage larger environments than just a simple 81F, you're going to have a number of policies, and you're going to want to make them as meaningful as possible. So in this case, it's just LAN to WAN. However, if if it was more specific policy, you would probably want to make sure the name was meaningful. Our incoming interface is going to be the LAN. So if you pictured yourself a packet that was leaving a computer going out to the WAN, your first interface you would go in through on the firewall would be the LAN facing interface. And the interface you're going to exit out of is going to be the WAN. Now the source, you should be as specific as possible with this. So we're going to go ahead and create an address object. Or LAN, and it's 10.220.28. Now you could have created this when you IP'd the interface by ticking the create interface IP object. Personally, I don't like that because it ties it to the interface, and it's just one more thing you have to delete. Plus, it's not as flexible, or I've seen it cause some issues in the past, although it's generally pretty good on 7.05. I've seen it cause issues, so I just tend to, call me a little bit old school, I tend to stick with the old way of doing things. The interface here doesn't matter. If you do tie it to a specific interface, you will not be able to call this object out in other policies. So if this were a remote IP address, say if we were going to go over a SSL VPN tunnel, or I'm sorry, IPsec VPN tunnel, and this IP address would live on the remote side, you make sure you want it to be set to any. In this case, I'm just going to leave it set to any. And our destination is going to be everywhere, so I'm not going to be particularly picky just yet. Our service is going to be all. I do want to take a step back, however, and talk a little bit about destination. So you see this addresses here. This is just all IP address based objects. Let's say you had a specific internet service you wanted to get to instead. So one of the ones that we typically, run across is probably going to be anything Microsoft. And Microsoft has lots of pages, lots of articles on their allowed IPs, their allowed ports, etc. And while these aren't applications, these are internet service objects. Like if we were to take a look at Office 365 and view the entries, you would see there's tons of IP addresses in here and the ports that are allowed. And this is fantastic. So the good folks over at FortiGate maintain this list for us, so we're not having to go and reference Microsoft's latest article on what IPs, ports, and protocols are allowed. So just be aware of internet service. So if you're trying to fine-tune what you're allowing traffic out to, that the ISDB, the Internet Service Database, is available to you. In this case, I'm just going to do all. My action is accept, and accept is not allow. If I were to just click OK on this policy, this would be an allow policy. It would just stop at anywhere it wants to go on any port it can go. However, I'm going to take this a step further and enable some security profiles, antivirus, application control. So by enabling these, accept means accept the session for further inspection, specifically by our security profiles. So please understand the difference there. Flow-based versus proxy-based. Flow-based is the FortiGate is monitoring it as a flow. So your endpoint is establishing the session directly with the target, whereas a proxy-based, the FortiGate is going to act more as a proxy, and it's going to proxy the connection. There's a couple of additional options that are available on proxy-based that you won't see from here, but one of those is being like a voice inspection. If you wanted to apply a specific VoIP profile, you can do that with proxy-based. But we're going to leave it as flow-based for now. Flow-based is generally better for performance. The security you get is generally on par, unless you have a specific use case for proxy-based. Flow-based is good enough. NAT. So back when I was talking about central NAT, I mentioned that the default NAT mode for FortiGate is policy NAT. If traffic matches this policy and it's allowed, we're going to go ahead and NAT it. And by default, we're going to NAT it using the outgoing interface address. So whatever the address is on the outside interface or the outgoing interface, which is in this case WAN 1, anything matching this policy is going to go out with an IP address of 10.220.27.10. We can change that, of course, to use a dynamic IP pool. And a dynamic IP pool is just that. It just depends on the type of object you want to create. I don't have anything created, but let's take a look at some of the options we would have for that. NAT overload, as you know, that is exactly what the use outgoing interface address is. The only difference here is maybe you don't want that IP address to be used. Maybe you have a block of IPs and you have a different IP you want to use there. Completely acceptable, totally fine. You can do that. One-to-one is when you have a specific service, when it goes out to the internet and when users access it, you can have that mapped to a different IP address. For source NAT, you would use a dynamic IP pool. For destination NAT, so inbound services, you would use a virtual IP. Now, I know there are options within the CLI to allow whatever service that's using a virtual IP to actually go outbound on that as well. I'm not going to go in depth in this video. Yes, that option is there. However, I prefer to remove all doubt and use the one-to-one for the outbound as well. That is my preference. It tends to work best for me, and it's really comes at no additional cost. It's more explicit, and I know what's going on every time, so there's no doubt. In this case, we're going to use outgoing interface address, and we're going to log all sessions. There's two reasons I'm doing this on this unit. Number one, it's an 81F, so the 1 tells me there's a hard disk drive on board, so we can store logs there. They'll last a lot longer. 2, if I ever want to send this to FortiAnalyzer later on in the future, having all sessions being logged, they'll all get shipped to FortiAnalyzer, and we can report off that later on. Okay, great. Now we have a policy that allows LAN to WAN communication. So if we go back to our Zorin box, we can take a look and try to go to the internet. Start.zorin.com is a good place to start. And it looks like we've got connectivity, and the reason, if we go ahead and click on YouTube, we've reached YouTube. So we've factory reset the device, format the log disk, set up our WAN connectivity, set up our LAN connectivity, set up a few basic services such as DNS, DHCP, and NTP, changed our admin ports, and built a simple policy to get us out to the internet. I'd like to thank you for watching. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and take a look at some preliminary decisions you're probably going to want to make now, as opposed to later on when you're like 30, 40 policies in and then have to re-architect everything. And one of those decisions is going to be whether or not you want to use the SD-WAN bundle from the get-go. I'd like to thank you for watching, and I hope this has been informative, and I'll see you on the next video.